Claims of alien abduction and run-ins with UFOs were ubiquitous in the black half of the 20th century, but no abduction story is quite as fascinating as that of Barney and Betty Hill. In 1961, this couple claimed that they were abducted by humanoids in rural New Hampshire. What became known as the Hill Abduction and the Zeta Reticuli Incident has everything: aliens, spaceships, lost time, and even hypnosis. What happened when the Hills came face to face with these extraterrestrials? Keep watching to find out. Number 1. The Hills were a fairly normal couple. Prior to their experience with a UFO, the Hills were mostly a normal couple. In 1961, their marriage wasn't legal yet. Barney was a black man and Betty was a white woman, a union that wasn't allowed in the United States until the U.S. Supreme Court repealed the anti-miscegenation laws in 1967. Barney worked at the United States Postal Service and Betty was a social worker. They were both members of the NAACP and were major parts of their local community who sat on a local board of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. The Hills weren't kooks. They weren't truthers. They were just trying to live their life and be happy. But everything changed on the night of September 19, 1961. Number 2. They ran into a UFO on vacation. Around 10:30 p.m. on September 19th, the Hills were driving to Portsmouth from a vacation in Niagara Falls when Betty noticed something in the sky just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire. Betty states that she saw the bright light zip from below the moon to a similar area in the sky as Jupiter. The Hills initially believed the light to be a falling star, but when it began moving upward, Betty asked Barney to pull over so they could get a better look. Barney stopped at a scenic picnic area just south of Twin Mountain, and through a pair of binoculars they noticed an odd-shaped vehicle with flashing multicolored lights moving across the face of the moon. It was then that Betty realized that she was seeing an actual UFO. Number 3. Barney thought it was a plane. Barney was initially skeptical that they were seeing a UFO. He was certain that they were checking out a commercial airliner traveling to Montreal, but after watching the craft change directions and descend quickly, he then changed his mind. The Hills decided to get back into their car and took off toward Franconia Notch, a narrow, mountainous road, thinking that their UFO experience was over for the evening. Boy, were they wrong. Number 4. The UFO tore across the sky. While driving down the twisted stretch of isolated road, the Hills realized that the UFO was on a similar course. The craft passed over a restaurant, a signal tower, and a mountain range. Betty claimed that the craft was about 1.5 times the length of the granite cliff profile of Cannon Mountain, and that the ship was rotating silently while moving around in the sky. Number 5. The Hills tried to escape. The couple report that the giant craft hovered about 100 feet above their car, and rather than burn rubber out of there, Barney got out of the vehicle once again, but this time with a pistol to get a closer look. He claimed that from his position on the road he could see between 8 to 11 humanoids staring right at him from the windows of the craft. Barney stated that one of the humanoids psychically communicated to him to stay where he was and to keep looking. From there, red lights began blinking on the edges of the craft before a telescope appeared on the side of the craft and a structure descended from the bottom of the ship. Number 6. The burning orb in the road. Even though he was told to stay put by the humanoids, Barney ran back to the car and shouted, "They're going to capture us." He jumped back in the car and tried to escape before the ship overtook their vehicle. A tingling sensation passed through their bodies, and this is when the Hills say that their minds became engulfed in a mental fuzz. After a series of beeping sounds, the Hills realized that they traveled close to 35 miles south. After shaking off their brain fog, they remembered that they'd made a sharp turn where they found a roadblock before seeing an orb burning brightly in the road. Number 7. They make it home with no recollection of the events that happened. The couple made it home as the sun was rising, and even though they couldn't fully remember what happened in the previous evening, they knew something was wrong. Betty wanted their luggage to stay near the back door, and Barney had an odd compulsion to check his nether regions. The couple both took incredibly long showers before drawing pictures of what they observed. Number 8. They didn't know what it was, but something was wrong. After a couple hours of sleep, Betty woke up and placed all of the clothing that she was wearing during the drive in her closet. She noted that there were rips in the dress, and that the zipper and hem were also ripped. Later, she threw the dress away before digging it out of the trash and saving it to have it analyzed. The Hills checked the trunk and noticed shiny, concentric circles that hadn't been there the day before. The couple then used a compass and placed it near the spots on the car where the compass went absolutely bananas. It was clear that something was off, but what was it? Number 9. Alert the military. 2 days after the event had happened, on September 21st, Betty called the Pease Air Force Base to report her encounter, but she withheld a few details so she didn't look totally crazy. Major Paul W. Henderson got back to the Hills the next day with follow-up questions, and in his report he noted that the couple probably just saw Jupiter. But what he didn't tell the Hills was that he had actually detected the UFO on their radar as well. Although later the report was changed to an optical condition, and later insufficient data. Number 10. Betty hits the books. Days after the encounter, Betty hit the books at her local library and found a passage written by retired Marine Corps Major Donald E. Kehoe, head of Civilian UFO Research Group NICAP, also known as the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Hill reached out to Kehoe on September 22nd to relate the full story, complete with details on the humanoids watching from inside the ship. Included in the letter was Hill's admission that she and her husband were thinking of undergoing hypnosis to get to the bottom of what happened and maybe find out more things they may have forgotten. Number 11. Barney believed he had a mental block on the abduction. Kehoe passed the letter along to NICAP investigator Walter Webb, who interviewed the Hills for 6 hours on October 21, 1961. In the interview, Barney admitted that there was a kind of mental block on his memories of the experience with the craft. He believed that there was something important about the event that he just couldn't remember. Webb stated, "They were telling the truth and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observations where a human judgment is involved." Number 12. Nightmares and dreamscapes. A little over a week after their alleged UFO encounter, Betty experienced a series of dreams that continued for 5 nights. At the end of the 5-night run, Betty's vivid dreams came to an abrupt end. She mentioned the dreams to Barney, but when he was unconcerned, she dropped the matter, but she was privately concerned. In November, Betty wrote down the details of her dreams, noting that in one of them the car was surrounded by men, and she had passed out while Barney fought to get control of their vehicle. Number 13. Were Betty's dreams her reality? In another dream, the men who circled Betty and Barney were absolutely clear. They were about 5 feet 4 inches tall and wore matching blue uniforms and hats that made them look like a military force of some sort. The humanoids had black hair, dark eyes, blue lips, and protruding noses. Their skin was gray in color, and they were able to make out that she and Barney sleepwalked to the craft. Number 14. The alien examination was cordial, sort of. Betty's remembrance has the Hills sleepwalking up a ramp into a disc-shaped craft of metallic appearance, followed by the dripped-out humanoids. The couple was separated once they made their way inside for ease of examination. Hill continues, stating that a humanoid that she refers to as the examiner spoke to her with a calm and pleasant demeanor, and that he explained to her that he was just trying to determine the differences between Betty and members of the crew. During his examination, he checks her extremities, cut off a piece of her hair, trimmed her fingernails, and shoved a needle into her navel. When she cried out in pain, the examiner allegedly waved his hand over her face and the pain dissipated. The examiner left the room and Betty engaged in conversation with the supposed leader. She picked up a book with rows of strange symbols that the leader said she could take home with her. She also asked where he came from, and then he supposedly pulled down an instructional map dotted with stars and then pointed out his home planet. Number 15. No souvenirs in space. After the examination, Betty spoke of the humanoid which she described as the leader, a creature who seemed to be in charge of, who was open about their time in space and who offered some items in the ship as kickbacks for her time there. When everything was said and done, a group of humanoids escorted the Hills from the ship and broke out into an argument over the book that Betty wanted to take home. Chastised for wanting to take home a commemorative object from her abduction, Betty insisted that she would remember the event regardless of what happened to their memory. When the Hills were returned to their car, the leaders suggested they watch the craft depart. After doing so, the Hills resumed their trip home. Number 16. The NICAP investigation. NICAP interviewed the Hills at length again on November 25, 1961, where they tried to hammer down just how long their trip aboard the craft took. The entire drive home from Niagara should have only taken 4 hours, but they didn't make it home until 7 hours after leaving Colebrook, New Hampshire. The couple was unable to explain this discrepancy in their story, only adding to the likelihood of an abduction. Neither of the Hills were able to explain their missing time between Indian Head and Ashland, but they did remember seeing the fiery orb. Although they initially believed the orb to be the moon, they were even more confused when they discovered that the moon had set long before their time on Route 3. It was then that the idea of hypnotizing the couple came up, something that Barney was interested in, if only to help Betty figure out what was happening with her dreams. Number 17. The Hills finally go public. The Hills kept quiet about their abduction until spring of 1963, when they spoke about the encounter with members of their church. In September of that year, the Hills spoke with Captain Ben H. Sweat of the United States Air Force, a guest speaker with their congregation, about the possibility of formal hypnosis. The couple was then referred to Benjamin Simon, a hypnosis from Boston. On December 14, 1963, the Hills had their first meeting with Simon, and he realized that Barney was much more anxious about the ordeal than he was letting on. Even though Simon didn't believe the UFO story, he did believe that the Hills believed their experience was real. Number 18. Hypnosis opened up the Hills' story even more. The Hills first underwent hypnotism on January 4, 1964, and their sessions lasted until June 6 of that year. During Barney's sessions, he recalled witnessing humanoid figures and remembering being truly fearful of what they were going to do to him. He admitted that he kept his eyes closed for much of the examination, thus he couldn't be certain about what he was seeing. In another session, Barney stated that after getting back to his car, he had the uncontrollable urge to drive into the woods. After seeing 6 humanoids standing near a dirt road, the car came to an abrupt stop and 3 of the humanoids approached the car. They told the Hills not to fear them, but Barney was still anxious. He said, "I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes." Number 19. Map to the Stars. When Betty was out under, she recounted a story incredibly similar to her dreams concerning the UFO abduction, with a few very specific distances relating to the initial capture and the couple's release. She also gave different details of the humanoids than from the retelling of her dreams, but her and Barney's hypnosis-induced memories were eerily consistent with one another. Following one incredibly emotional session, Simon suggested that Betty sketch the star map that she later described as a 3D projection. Like something out of a B-movie, She drew the stars that immediately jumped out to her, which quickly became a map of 12 major stars connected by 3 lines and 3 smaller stars that formed a distinct triangle. She explained that the stars formed are a series of trade routes. Number 20. Simon remained skeptical. Simon never did get on board with the Hills' story of their abduction. He believed that Barney's remembrance of the encounter was likely inspired by Betty's dreams, although Barney disagreed. Even though the Hills and Simon disagreed on the story of the abduction, the Hills were grateful for the hypnosis treatment as it greatly eased their anxiety over the events of 1961. Number 21. The Hills were never abducted again. Following their work with Simon, the Hills pretty much went back to their normal lives. They were open about their experience with the UFO, but they didn't seek out publicly for their alleged abduction. The couple came to international attention on October 25, 1965, when the Boston Traveler published the story, UFO Chiller, Did They Seize a Couple? By John H. Luttrell, a reporter who heard an audio recording of a talk that the couple gave in 1963. In 1966, John G. Fuller wrote The Interrupted Journey, a book about the case with the cooperation of the Hills and Simon. The book included Simon's findings as well as Betty's star map. 3 years later, on February 25, 1969, Barney passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 46. Betty never remarried, and she continued to tell her story whenever she was asked until she passed away on October 17, 2004 at 85 years old. What do you think about the Hills encounter? Do you think it was real? Or do you think it was just a hoax like everyone else? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below.